Welcome to Reinventing Parking, the podcast about parking policy for anyone who wants a better city and better urban transport. Welcome again to Reinventing Parking. I'm your host, Paul Barter. This time I want to quickly tell you about a new project I've been working on. I've been trying to be as useful as I can for parking reformers all over the world, and so I'm working on a new resource. It's called the Parking Reform Atlas, and you can find it at www.parkingreformatlas, all one word, .org. parkingreformatlas.org. So my aim with this Parking Reform Atlas is to gradually build up a really rich set of examples of noteworthy parking policies and parking reforms from all over the world. I want to make it easier for you to find useful parking reform examples from various contexts, but especially contexts that are relevant to you. In a minute, I'll give you some examples of highlights from the site so far, in the hope of tempting you to go visit the site and make good use of it. But before I do that, I want to mention that I'm actually hoping for help from you. When you go to the site, I hope you'll explore it and make good use of it, but I also hope that you'll then click on the How to Help button. That will take you to a page where you can submit comments, such as suggesting improvements, additions, or offering corrections. If you have suggestions, please give me some links, point me in the right direction for finding more information. And by all means, please do tell me about any noteworthy parking reforms that you know about, or maybe even that you've been involved in. As of late April 2021, the Atlas has 34 cases. So it's new, it's a work in progress, but I'm planning to make it grow steadily into a really valuable resource for parking reformers everywhere. If you go to the main page, you can simply scroll through lots of cases, or you can use a search bar at the top, or you can use a bunch of filters. So you can filter by reform type, by region of the world, and various others. At this stage, with relatively few cases, scrolling or using the search bar seems to work best. But in the future, when we have perhaps hundreds of cases, those filters will be very useful, I think. So now let me mention some of the interesting cases, just very, very briefly, to give you a sense of what's there. The most recent case is from New Zealand. The title is Urban Parking Minimums Banned by New Zealand's National Government. Well, at least their local governments are banned by the national government if they are in an urban settlement with 10,000 people or more. So it's almost a national ban on minimum parking requirements. And always on this main page, I have a section, there's a brief description of the reform, and then there's a section, why should you care? I also mention, is it a model for others? And I sometimes that's a little ambiguous, but in this case, I think this is a useful model. So I've got useful model. And then why should you care? Well, this is an example of a growing trend for higher levels of government, national or state or province, to restrict the ability of local governments to enact excessive parking requirements. Another recent case that I added to the Parking Reform Atlas was parking permit innovation in Portland's Northwest Parking District. And why should you care about that one? Well, it's a case of making it politically feasible to set high parking permit prices. Most residential parking permits around the world are set very, very cheaply. This is a case of rather expensive parking permits. And it's a noteworthy case for that reason. They've managed to find a combination of rules, price points, exemptions, and incentives that managed to win local support for high permit prices and a permit arrangement that is cleverly devised to make a real difference to the on-street parking situation. There's also a case recently from Rio de Janeiro, where residential parking minimums were replaced by maximums, at least in localities near mass transit. So why should you care about that? Well, the momentum around the world to reform parking minimums and to consider parking maximums seems to be gathering steam in Latin America. So Rio de Janeiro has joined Mexico City and Sao Paulo in enacting this kind of reform or something like this kind of reform. But by the way, parking maximums are controversial amongst parking reformers. Some of us agree with them, some of us don't. My view is that parking maximums close to high quality mass transit are appropriate, although they may or may not be appropriate anywhere else. Another case, this time from sub Saharan Africa, Nairobi is planning a shift to time based on street parking fees. That's to replace the current flat rate per day fees. And this is an example of a parking reform that hasn't actually happened yet. It's just a proposal. Most of the reforms so far have actually already been implemented. This one's just a proposal. But let's hope Nairobi goes ahead. Because why should you care about this? Well, cities like Nairobi, which currently have a flat fee for all day on street parking, really should be considering shifting to time based fees. So I'm glad that Nairobi is considering that. This is a mundane seeming change that is actually very important. A fee per hour can improve street parking conditions and actually have a strong parking management impact by discouraging especially long duration parking in the prime locations. By contrast, having a flat rate fee that's not duration based, not time based, can't play any useful parking management role. It's really just about revenue. And even about revenue, it performs poorly. So this reform would be very useful in Nairobi. Another example from the Parking Reform Atlas, France actually limits how high local governments can set their parking minimums. So why should you care? Again, this is another example of a higher level of government being interested in setting limits on the ability of local government to set excessive minimum parking requirements. In this case, unlike New Zealand, which has more or less banned many of its councils from doing that, in France, they just set a limit on how high the minimums can be. An example from Montreal in Canada is the Montreal parking tax, which has higher rates on surface parking. This is a tax that applies in the central area, the downtown and adjacent inner areas. Exterior surface parking is taxed at a higher rate than indoor parking. So this tax applies to all non-residential parking. So why should you care? Well, it's apparently played a strong role, this tax, in spurring the redevelopment of many surface parking lots in the area. That could be a useful model for cities that are plagued with an excessive amount of surface parking in their downtown areas, which is a common problem in North America especially. Singapore in 1980 made a shift from collecting parking fees in the street in a labor intensive way using attendance. It shifted to prepaid coupons, paper coupons. This one, why should you care? It's a reminder that there are many cities around the world where parking meters have never been used for on street parking payments or in street parking machines. So, in quite a few countries, Brazil, Malaysia, Ireland, Israel, and Singapore, prepaid parking coupons were the way parking fees were collected in the street for a long time. Increasingly, these places are shifting now to mobile, digital based parking fee collections. So an example of that is another case. Tel Aviv has mobile only on-street parking payments. So Tel Aviv is a case where it used to use a similar system to Singapore, where there were pre-purchased paper coupons, and it had that system since 1972. But recently, Tel Aviv shifted to only being able to either pay by phone. There are two companies offering pay by phone payments for casual on-street parking, or you can have an in-vehicle meter. There's one company offering that. And that's especially appropriate for delivery vehicles and that kind of thing, although some private cars also have that. This is a case of another case of a city that has never really had in-street parking meters. They do have parking machines in off-street parking sometimes, but in the streets they don't have parking meters and never really have. So There's a handful of cities around the world doing this, but this obviously saves an enormous amount of investment, capital investment in your parking payment system. And it's a promising approach for cities that haven't yet invested in parking meters. Probably cities like that should skip the parking meter phase altogether. I have a case talking about parking in Seoul's employer-based TDM program, Seoul in Korea. So parking plays a prominent role in the travel demand management program in Seoul. There's a case about London parking maximums and the abolition of parking minimums almost completely. There's also a case about Dublin in Ireland has parking maximums, not minimums. Seattle has performance-based parking pricing in the streets, and there's a case explaining how that works. Recently, Edmonton abolished its minimum parking requirements and replaced it with something that it calls open option parking, basically meaning that real estate developers can decide how much parking to provide with any development. So there's a case about that reform. There's a case about how Hong Kong had just briefly in the 1970s very low residential parking maximums, and how that policy, even though it only applied for less than 10 years, has had a long-term impact on the parking scene in Hong Kong. It's left a legacy of high prices and relatively low supply. There's a case about Jeddah in Saudi Arabia introducing on-street parking management and on-street parking fees, and how even in a city of 4 million people that only has 6 bus routes and no urban rail system, even in a city like that, on-street parking fees have made a difference to the on-street parking situation for the better. There's a case about Mexico City replacing its parking minimums with maximums. There's a case about Moscow in Russia improving its on-street parking pricing and parking management. There's a case about Calgary in Canada implementing demand-based parking pricing, similar to the Seattle case that I mentioned before. And then there's also a few cases from Japan. One of them is about Japan's proof of parking rule that I know many people around the world are quite curious about. And there's another case about Japan's relatively mild and moderate low impact parking minimums. Japan has not abolished parking minimums, but it does have parking minimums that are relatively less harmful than parking minimums in other countries. There's a case about the digital blue zone in Sao Paulo in Brazil. And this is another case like the Tel Aviv case before of a city that the primary way, and more or less the only way you can pay for parking in the street, is through digital means, through mobile phone means. Singapore unbundles the parking costs in its public housing. So if you're a tenant or a resident in public housing, if you own a flat in public housing, you'll be paying for your parking separately from your house, which is good for housing affordability. This is a little known fact about Singapore's public housing. I've got a case about the improved on-street parking management in Makati, which is in Metro Manila, a surprisingly robust on-street parking management system. So I think that's enough for now. As I said before, please do visit the Parking Reform Atlas site. I hope I've captured your interest and shown you that there's quite a lot of interesting cases there. I hope you'll find something there already that might be useful to you. But if not, over the next months, more and more cases will be added, and I hope it will become more and more of a useful resource to you. And as I said before, please go there and click on the How to Help page and offer suggestions for how I can help improve the Parking Reform Atlas even more. Thanks a lot, and bye for now. You've been listening to the Reinventing Parking podcast, and I'm Paul Barter. You can find out more at reinventingparking.org, where you'll find ideas and tips on parking policy. You can also listen to other episodes, subscribe, or leave a comment. That's reinventingparking.org. Bye for now.